For 40 years, she dedicated every second of her life to the family she raised. But all it took was the reading of a will for everyone to turn their backs. What they didn't know was that this fragile woman was hiding the biggest secret of all. And when the truth came out, none of them were prepared for the price they would pay. Watch until the end and discover how fate took the perfect turn. A true story of pain, betrayal, and justice, where the true value of a life isn't measured by money but by the choices we make. Donna Adelaide has always been the foundation of her family. Widowed at a young age, she raised her 3 children alone, with great sacrifice and silent sacrifices. She lived in a simple house in an old Boston neighborhood where each brick bore a story of love, pain, and overcoming. For decades, she worked as a seamstress, caring for other families' clothes while diligently crafting the future of her children. Marcos, the eldest, always ambitious. Claudia, the middle daughter, proud and distant. And Henrique, the youngest, who seemed more sensitive but also let himself be carried away by the glitter of money. When Adelaide began showing the first signs of fatigue and memory lapses, she thought it was just age catching up with her. She never liked to feel like a burden. She continued to take care of the house, cook, crochet to sell, and text her children, even when she didn't receive a response. On Sundays, she baked a cake and set the table, hoping one of them would show up for afternoon tea. But the children were too busy. Marcos was a lawyer and spent most of his time in meetings, many of them fueled by whiskey and hidden agendas. Claudia lived in another city and maintained a flawless image on social media, but rarely called to check on her mother. Henrique, who lived closer, still visited occasionally, but always in a hurry, with his cell phone in hand and an air of impatience. As the months passed, Adelaide began forgetting pots on the stove, locking the door with the key on the inside and leaving the faucet running. Neighbors noticed and tried to help, but they had no authority to intervene. One day, she fell in the backyard and spent hours on the ground until a delivery man found her. She was taken to the hospital and her children finally mobilized, but not with affection, but with practicality. In a quick, cold meeting, they decided it would be best to place her in a nursing home. Claudia claimed she couldn't leave work. Marco said he didn't have room at home. Henry agreed, murmuring that it would be best for everyone. Adelaide, too weak to argue, simply nodded. She took with her only a small suitcase, a photo album, and the rosary her mother had given her when she was young. At the nursing home, the days passed slowly. Adelaide didn't complain. Loneliness was her most constant companion, but she learned to live with the silence. Birthdays came and went without visitors. Phone calls were rare. She watched the other elderly receive flowers, gifts, and affection, while staring at the door, always waiting. But no one came. It was there, between the cold walls and the constant smell of medicine and disinfectant, that Adelaide began to write. She started a notebook where she recounted her entire story, from her youth to that moment. She wrote not for revenge, but to leave a record. Because I knew, deep down, there was still time for one last lesson. Adelaide might have been forgotten by her children, but she hadn't forgotten who she was, and time, as always, would be her ally. At that nursing home, she also met Beatrice, a kind staff member who, unlike Adelaide's children, always offered her time and attention. Beatrice would become a crucial presence in the fate of this story, because what goes around comes around. And Donna Adelaide was just beginning to stitch together the final chapter of a life that deserved to be remembered with respect. Donna Adelaide clearly remembered the times when her children were small, when she would rush back and forth between the sewing machine and the stove, trying to balance household chores with the childish desires only a mother understands. The blanket tucked in at dawn, the favorite snack hidden in the school bag, the steadfast presence at meetings even when her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. All of this now seemed like a distant echo. The people who once called out to her in tears now didn't even remember her birthday. The saddest thing was realizing that their children were doing well. Claudia posted smiling photos with co-workers at expensive dinners. Marcos gave interviews on legal podcasts, and Henrique showed off his newly renovated apartment with custom furniture. None of them, however, mentioned Adelaide. She became a shadow in their lives, an inconvenient memory, like an old letter tucked away in the back of a drawer that no one has the courage to throw away, but also doesn't want to reread. The photo album she took to the nursing home was her greatest treasure. Every night before bed, she would open it slowly, running her wrinkled fingers over the images as if, with a touch, she could relive the moments. There was one in particular that hurt her more than all, a black and white photo taken in a park. In it, Adelaide held Henrique in her arms, while Claudia and Marcos ran ahead, laughing. Her face was young, tired, but full of light. Hope for the future still shone in her eyes. Now the mirror reflected a frail woman, her hands stained by time and her white hair carefully combed by Beatrice, the gentle caretaker who seemed to be the only one to notice that Adelaide still existed. Beatrice was different, not just because of her affection, but because of her genuine listening. She would sit beside the elderly woman in the late afternoons, as the sun gilded the curtains, and the silence began to descend upon the place like a gentle mist. She listened patiently as Adelaide spoke of the past, of the dresses she had sewn with love, of the promises she had made to her children at her husband's deathbed, of the faith that had always sustained her even when everything seemed to be falling apart. It was during one of these conversations that Beatrice learned about the notebook. "It's a way to keep my head clear, my daughter," Adelaide said, hugging him to her chest. "But also, maybe one day someone will need to know everything, to understand that a mother is a person too." Beatrice moved, promised to help her organize her writings. She began typing the accounts little by little during her downtime. Deep down, it seemed to her more than just an old woman's outburst. It was a life story, a testament to human dignity. Meanwhile, outside, the world kept turning. Claudia was launching a new marketing campaign, Marcos was winning a new $1 million case, and Henrique was planning a trip to Europe. None of them remembered visiting Adelaide. They thought they had done the right thing by leaving her at the nursing home. After all, she was well cared for, had food to eat, a place to sleep, and someone to bathe her. Affection, they thought, was a superfluous detail, an optional kindness. But for Adelaide, the abandonment was daily, a chronic forgetfulness that worsened with each missed date, each unanswered call, each vague promise of, "I'll go next week." At Christmas, she prepared small handmade cards for each child. Beatrice helped mail the envelopes. Adelaide spent the following days in anticipation, watching the door in the hope of seeing one of her children appear with a smile and a hug. But what arrived was just a generic gift, with a secretary's name written on it and no personal note. She cried silently that night. "They erased me from their lives, Beatrice," he whispered, his voice breaking, "as if I never existed." Beatrice held his hand firmly. "You still exist. I see you every day, and the world will see you too." Those words echoed in Adelaide's mind. That night, she decided her notebook wouldn't just be a diary, it would be a message, a letter to the future, a denunciation perhaps, a record for when her children finally stopped to look back, if that ever happened. One of the following mornings, Beatrice brought out an old notebook and began typing Adelaide's stories with more zeal. They created chapters, dates, and added old scanned photos. Beatrice had a journalist friend, and secretly considered sending him part of the story. Not to expose Adelaide's pain, to ridicule, but to show the world that behind every abandoned elderly person lay a past worthy of respect. The news that Beatrice was helping to write a book began to circulate discreetly through the nursing home's corridors. Some staff members whispered, thinking it was just old lady delusions. Others were moved and offered help, but most ignored it. After all, Adelaide was just another elderly woman among many. To Beatrice, however, she was unique. On a gray Sunday, As the rain fell lightly outside, Adelaide asked, "Beatrice, do you think that if one day they read what I wrote, they will understand?" "I think so, Ms. Adelaide, or at least they'll have to face the truth." Adelaide smiled sadly. The truth sometimes hurts, but lies hurt much more. And they lie to themselves every day. They pretend I was an ordinary mother, when in reality, I was everything for them. Beatrice didn't respond. She simply hugged Adelaide affectionately. She knew those words came from a wounded but lucid heart. Meanwhile, the notebook grew. The pages multiplied, and with them, Adelaide's inner strength grew. She was rebuilding herself, word by word, remembering who she was, everything she'd done, and how forgotten she'd been. But above all, she was finding a way to leave her mark, because even if the children didn't want to hear it, the world needed to hear it. And time, as she always knew, has a way of bringing everything to light, including the truths buried beneath the mask of convenience and family coldness. The silent seamstress now sewed memories, and each stitch was an act of resistance against oblivion. Winter arrived early that year. The mornings in Boston were shrouded in thick fog, and the nursing home windows were patterned with the steam from the elderly's breath. Donna Adelaide was now wrapped more tightly in a blue shawl she had knitted herself years ago. Her fingers were no longer as steady, but her gaze maintained a serene and determined clarity. She hadn't given up writing. On the contrary, she seemed to write with more urgency, as if something inside her told her time was running out. Beatrice, in turn, had become more than a caretaker. She was now an accomplice and guardian of that silent legacy. The two established a routine. After lunch, Adelaide would dictate or hand over new handwritten pages. At night, Beatrice would type everything up on the old computer, saving it in files named with dates and titles like The Unfulfilled Promise or The Silence of My Sundays. The story, however, truly began to take shape when Beatrice decided to show some excerpts to her journalist friend, Daniel. He worked at a local newspaper and was interested in human stories, the kind few see but carry profound weight. When he read the first few pages, he remained silent for several minutes. Then he said only one thing. "This isn't just a simple story. It's an emotional testament. It's a silent denunciation of abandonment. This needs to be told." Beatrice hesitated. Adelaide never said she wanted fame or exposure. She just wanted to be heard, recognized, perhaps by her own children. But something inside her told her that this story could help other Adelaides out there. Forgotten mothers, invisible grandmothers, women who gave everything and were repaid with silence. With Adelaide's consent, Daniel published a simple, almost anonymous article with the title, "Letters from an Invisible Mother, The Loneliness of Adelaide." The article didn't include surnames or full names. It was more of an emotional essay than a report. But the response was overwhelming. Within days, the newspaper received hundreds of messages from readers. Many expressed their feelings of emotion. Others shared similar stories. Some called to ask if they could visit the woman. Others wanted to know if she needed anything. Some even sent flowers and letters to the nursing home, even though they had never met Adelaide. The institution's director was surprised by the volume of correspondence. "What's going on?" he asked Beatrice. "What should have happened a long time ago is happening," she replied. "They're finally seeing Miss Adelaide." When the elderly woman received the first bouquet of flowers with a note that read, "You are not alone," she cried profusely. For a moment she felt alive again. The world outside, the same world her children thought more important than her, was finally reaching out to her. "I never imagined," he whispered to Beatrice, "that my voice could still touch someone." Gradually, more media outlets began to take an interest. A local podcast wanted to interview her. A small publisher offered to turn the stories into a book. And most unexpectedly, influential people began talking about elderly neglect as a silent epidemic. Adelaide's name became symbolic, even though many didn't know who she really was. But not everyone was happy with the repercussions. Henrique was the first to discover the article. A co-worker sent him the link with the message, "Isn't this lady your mother?" He turned pale. He read it all at once, his stomach churning. Then he tried to cover it up, saying it was an exaggeration, that she'd always been dramatic. He called Claudia, who was at a fashion event. She responded coldly, "This will ruin our family's image. She should keep quiet." Marcos, in turn, reacted with contempt. He sent a curt email to Beatriz, demanding that they stop using his mother's story for sensationalist purposes. Beatriz didn't respond. She simply showed the email to Adelaide, who read it calmly and with a slight smile said, "Now they know I'm still here." She didn't want revenge. She just wanted them to look into her eyes and see the woman who once held their hands in the dark, who shared their bread, who deprived herself of dreams to realize theirs. Now, if the world saw, perhaps it would be the first step. The notebook, which was previously hers alone, became a symbol. The other women at the nursing home began writing as well. They created a small group called Silent Voices. Beatriz organized reading afternoons where each woman would read something from her life. The staff began to treat them with more care, listening more. Something had changed. Something had been awakened. And although Adelaide knew her children might never apologize, she felt rewarded in another way. Her pain was no longer just hers. It had become an echo that resonated in many hearts, and that, in itself, was justice. On the last page she wrote that month, Adelaide wrote a loose sentence almost like a whisper. "If they ever look for me, they will know where to find me. In the silence they left, I planted my story." And Beatrice, upon reading that, was certain that Adelaide's legacy would never be erased. The post about Ms. Adelaide, though anonymous, spread like a warm breeze amidst the ice of indifference. What began as a timid article in a local newspaper turned into a wave of empathy that grew daily. But for Adelaide's children, the repercussions had a different flavor, the bitterness of exposure, of shame, of the mirror that showed them what they had chosen to ignore for so long. Henrique was the first to be directly confronted. At an informal meeting at his company, a colleague in HR casually mentioned, "Did you see that story? About the woman forgotten in a nursing home? I cried reading it. It made me think of my parents. They say her children are educated, well off, and then they just disappeared. So cruel, right?" Henrique, who was drinking coffee at the time, choked. He covered it with a cough and said with a weak smile, "The press loves to exaggerate. These stories always have another side." But inside, his skin burned. He knew the story had his mother's DNA in it. Every sentence, every expression, every small gesture described there was like a flashback he'd tried to bury, unsuccessfully. Claudia, in turn, received a call from the head of the agency where she worked in New York. "Claudia, do you know someone named Adelaide? They're saying she's your mother. We don't know if it's true, but some people have linked the surname. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but you know how image speaks volumes." The middle daughter, always concerned with appearances, was stunned. She felt as if the ground had dropped out from under her feet. For the first time in years, she was overcome by something resembling regret. But pride prevailed. "This is so damned exposed," she told herself in the mirror that night as she angrily removed her makeup. "She should have come to us. She's the one who isolated herself." But deep down, Claudia knew the story was true. She herself had distanced herself. She had chosen to pursue her career, her independence, her freedom, but she never looked back. She never wondered if her mother still ate alone on Sundays. She never wanted to know. Marcos, the eldest son, was the last to react. A renowned lawyer with influential clients and an ego to match his success, he saw his mother's name discreetly circulating in closed circles of Boston's legal elite. A fellow professional sent a subtle but venomous message. "Marcos, is this your mother? I hope it's fiction. If it's true, be careful. The past always takes its toll." That was too much for him. He sent a formal email to the newspaper, demanding the article be retracted and threatening legal action. He received a polite letter in response. The lady in question voluntarily authorized the publication of the content. There is no violation of her image as no full name was mentioned. We remain available to clarify any legal questions, but at this time, we will not remove the publication. Marcos felt the taste of impotence. He, the manipulator of contracts and clauses, had been defeated by the simple words of a forgetful woman, and it ate away at him. While her children struggled in their cold, calculated worlds, Adelaide flourished in her productive silence. More visitors began to come to the nursing home. Young journalism students, elderly people inspired by her story, and even elder rights activists began to rally around her name. They called her the voice of hope. Beatriz, increasingly involved, created a small website where she published excerpts from the stories with illustrations made by volunteers. The site received over 50,000 hits within a few weeks. A publisher finally signed a contract for a book, and with part of the proceeds, Adelaide requested that a fund be created to help other seniors in similar situations. Meanwhile, Henry began to suffer in silence. His wife, upon discovering the situation, was outraged. "You told me your mother was fine. How could you leave her in a nursing home without telling me the real situation? She fell in the backyard and no one knew." Henry tried to justify himself, but he felt increasingly cornered. The image he'd maintained, as a present son, a busy man, a dedicated professional, was beginning to crumble. He suffered from insomnia for days. He began avoiding social gatherings. Something inside him was finally beginning to awaken. Guilt. Claudia started receiving anonymous messages on her social media. "Are you Adelaide's daughter? How embarrassing." Abandons mother and then posts about empathy. Hypocrisy has a name: Claudia. Faced with this, her strategy was to delete all old posts, archive family photos, and keep her profile private. But the emotional damage was done. She began drinking more, missing work deadlines, and had her first panic attack weeks later. For the first time, she saw loneliness as a sentence, one she wrote herself. Marcos, in the end, was the most resistant. He tried to control the narrative, contacted acquaintances in the press, and paid for crisis counseling. But all of this only reinforced his image of coldness. The public, now moved by the figure of the silent and resilient elderly woman, no longer wanted to hear excuses. They wanted gestures, and Marcos no longer knew how to demonstrate humanity without appearing staged. One day, all 3 children received a letter. It wasn't Adelaide's, it was Beatriz's. In the envelope was a simple invitation: book launch of Letters from an Invisible Mother, an evening to honor forgotten stories. You're invited, not as a celebrity, but as a son. Enrique trembled as he read it. Claudia cried but didn't respond. Marcos tore up the invitation, but kept the part with the cover photo. Hand-embroidered piece with the name Adelaide in blue thread. The event was held in a modest auditorium with a capacity of 200 people. The hall was packed. There were journalists, seniors, caregivers, students, and writers. Adelaide was wheeled onto the stage. She no longer wrote with the same energy, but her gaze remained ablaze. Beatriz held her hand. She didn't speak. She simply clutched the rosary in her hands and smiled. At the back of the audience, Enrique appeared, wearing a cap and dark coat. He sat in the last row, silent. Seeing her, his eyes filled with tears. Claudia watched from home via the online broadcast, alone, in the dark. For the first time, she saw her mother as a woman, as a story, as a heroine. Marcos remained silent. But that day, for the first time, Adelaide didn't feel invisible. The world saw her. The pain, which had once been an open wound, was now a scar, raw, but closed. And as time always teaches, what goes around comes around. And the children, previously so busy seeing her, now had to face her where it hurt most, in their conscience. Time at the nursing home was marked by a predictable routine: meals served on time, physical therapy sessions, reading groups, and a constant silence broken only by coughs, nurses' footsteps, and the clinking of cutlery in the dining rooms. Donna Adelaide already knew every sound, every smell, and every corner of that place. She was a silent shadow among the hallways, someone who went unnoticed. Or almost. Beatrice, the employee who demonstrated sincere affection, remained Adelaide's only link to the outside world. She read excerpts from the elderly woman's notebook and, little by little, began to understand the depth of the pain the woman carried. More than abandonment, there was ingratitude, contempt, and a past that had been erased from her children's memories in the name of status and money. But something started to change. Beatrice noticed that lately, Adelaide had been locking herself in her room earlier, spending hours poring over old letters, yellowed documents, old photos, and contracts. Yes, contracts. Inside an old sewing box, Adelaide kept records of everything she had achieved throughout her life. The purchase of the house, the donation she had made to her son Henrique when he wanted to start a business, the loans Marcos took to college, the monthly deposits she sent to Claudia when she became unemployed. But the most surprising thing came later. Adelaide still owned 2 valuable parcels of land in the Boston metropolitan area, purchased decades ago when no one cared about the land. Today, they were sought-after tracts of land with the potential to fetch millions. The documents were all there, intact, registered with the land registry, and none of her children knew about it. Beatrice, surprised, asked why she never mentioned anything. Adelaide, with a serene smile, replied, "Because they didn't deserve to know, yet." In the days that followed, Beatrice helped Adelaide organize a folder with all her documents. She took her to the notary's office, helped with notarizations, registration updates, and even set up a digital bank account. What seemed like a forgotten old lady in a nursing home was, in fact, a woman strategically preparing the final move of her life, a silent checkmate. One afternoon, sitting with Beatrice under a tree in the asylum garden, Adelaide said, "When we're a mother, we give without expecting anything. But when we're a woman, we have the right to be respected. I've been forgotten, but I've not been defeated. And now it's my turn to choose who deserves what I've sown." Beatrice, overcome with emotion, held her hand. For the first time in a long time, Adelaide didn't look fragile. She looked strong, clear-headed, determined. In the following days, Adelaide sought a lawyer. Beatrice accompanied her. She decided to change her will, which previously divided everything equally between her children. In the new document, Beatrice would receive the land and the house where Adelaide had raised her children. The children would be left with a letter, a handwritten letter in which Adelaide held no grudges but taught one final lesson. Each line of the letter was like a fine needle, stitching together painful truths with the tenderness of someone who loves even though they haven't been loved in return. She didn't condemn them, but reminded them of everything they'd ignored. The lonely Sundays, the unanswered phone calls, the Christmases spent alone, the forgotten birthdays, the ignored pleas for help. At the end of the letter, a sentence. "If you couldn't share your life with me, you won't share the inheritance I built with her either." The lawyer was struck by Adelaide's serenity. Beatrice cried when she heard the words, and Adelaide just smiled. "They made their choices. I'm making mine too," she said with dignity. Time was ticking, but now it no longer seemed cruel. For Adelaide, the future was not a burden, but a promise, that even abandoned, she still had the power to write the end of her story with justice. And that end was closer than anyone imagined. Winter arrived in Boston with a vengeance that year. The trees in the asylum garden were bare, their thin branches like hands reaching out to the sky in supplication. Inside the warm room, Donna Adelaide lay huddled under her old woolen blanket, watching the world through the window. Each fallen leaf seemed to symbolize a broken bond, and, deep down, she knew something was about to happen. After the change in her will, Adelaide began to live with a disconcerting serenity. There was no longer any anguish in her eyes, no haste in her gestures. Everything was in its right place. She had told her entire story, organized her possessions, left handwritten letters with instructions to be opened at the right time, and entrusted everything to Beatrice, the one who had become more like a daughter than any of the three by blood. Beatrice, for her part, began to suspect that Adelaide didn't have much time left. There was a strange lightness in the air, as if the elderly woman were slowly saying goodbye to the world. But she never complained. On the contrary, she began to smile more often, write even more, and even teach crochet to other women in the nursing home. What seemed like resignation was, in fact, preparation. And it was in this atmosphere of tranquility that the phone rang. It was Marcos. After months of no sign of life, he called the nursing home in a strained and overly polite voice. "Good afternoon, I'm Mrs. Adelaide's son. Is she still there?" The receptionist found the tone strange and forwarded the call to management. Marcos wanted to know about his mother's health, her current condition, and her financial situation. All very disguised, of course, but the nursing home director, already informed by Beatrice, simply said that Adelaide was fine and that any further information should be discussed with her or her legal representative. In the following days, the other two children also began to appear. Enrique was the first to visit. He arrived with a worried expression, carrying a bag of fruit and a box of chocolates, as if that could make up for years of absence. He sat next to his mother, asked how she was, and gradually got closer to the real issue. "Mom, I was remembering the land you had. Are they still in your name?" Adelaide just smiled, without responding. Claudia showed up 2 days later, wearing a designer coat and bringing expensive flowers. She sat down, looked around with a slight expression of disgust, and said, "I think you should get out of here. We can find a better place for you. Or maybe, come back to live with me, right?" The scene repeated itself with slight variations. The children, once so busy, suddenly showed interest, care, and even affection. But there was something forced, almost rehearsed, in each gesture. They didn't know the will had already been changed. They didn't know Beatrice was the sole heir, and, most importantly, they didn't know Adelaide was watching them with clear eyes, seeing beyond the rehearsed words, beyond the cold embraces, beyond the guilt disguised as attention. It was then that Adelaide decided to do something unexpected. She invited the three of them to lunch at the nursing home. She asked management for permission herself and, with Beatrice's help, organized everything. She made a point of choosing the menu, the flowers on the table, and even the background music, old songs she used to sing while sewing. When the children arrived, they found their mother, elegantly dressed, sitting at the head of the table, with a calm smile on her face. She didn't look like a frail old woman, but a matriarch in control. Lunch passed with false smiles and empty questions. Adelaide simply listened. At the end, she stood up, asked for silence, and said, "I'm glad you came. I've prepared something special for today. Each of you will receive a letter from me. But I want you to read it only after I'm gone. Until then, live your lives as you see fit. I only ask one thing: sincerity. Because everything that remains unsaid one day returns, sometimes silently, sometimes in the form of a storm." The children looked at each other, confused. Adelaide hugged them, one by one, and for the first time in years, her eyes were filled with peace. That night, Beatrice found Adelaide sitting in the garden, looking up at the starry sky. She smiled and said, "I'm ready." Beatrice held his hand. "Ready for what, Mrs. Adelaide?" "For whatever comes. But most importantly, ready to leave everything in its rightful place." And in that complicit silence between the two, time seemed to stop. Because what goes around comes around. And the return of the children had been only the beginning of the lesson that destiny still had to teach. Weeks after lunch at the nursing home, the daily lives of Dona Adelaide's children began to change, but not as they expected. Still believing they could regain control of their mother's inheritance, Marcos, Claudia, and Enrique began meeting more frequently, driven by greed. They created a WhatsApp group, discreetly called Familia 2025. But the conversations revolved around one thing: Adelaide's estate. "Does she have any other properties that we don't know about?" Claudia asked in one of the conversations. "The important thing is that we need to make sure she doesn't change the will," Marcos replied. "Or if she did, we have to invalidate it." Enrique, ever more hesitant, tried to argue. "What if she's already distributed everything? What if we're no longer heirs?" The brothers ignored him. For them, there was still time to reverse any decision. After all, they believed all they had to do was press a little harder, please a little more, and convince their mother they were worthy. What they didn't know was that Adelaide's decision was final, and already in the hands of the courts with a lawyer appointed by Beatriz, everything legalized and sealed. Beatriz, silent, remained firmly by Adelaide's side. She continued reading to her, helping with meals, reviewing her memoirs, and laughing at Adelaide's jokes. Sometimes Adelaide looked at her as if she were her own real daughter. Not by chance, Beatriz had taken on this role out of love, not obligation. And then, on a freezing January afternoon, Adelaide had a crisis. A drop in blood pressure landed her in the hospital. The diagnosis wasn't good. Her heart was too weak. The doctors were blunt. It was time to prepare for the worst. Beatriz, with tears in her eyes, stayed by the elderly woman's side the entire time. She warned her children, who arrived in a hurry and anxiously. Not out of genuine concern, but because time seemed to be running out to secure what they believed was rightfully theirs. Marcos was the first to start a conversation. "Mom, I know you've been through a lot, but we're here now, and we're going to take care of you." Claudia, without much subtlety, added, "And if you need to change something, anything in the will, there's still time, right?" Enrique remained silent, visibly uncomfortable. Adelaide, with a weak but firm voice, replied, "I've already changed what I needed to change. And no, there's no more time. What was in my arms was passed on to those who were truly with me. The rest is vanity." The three were shocked. Claudia's eyes widened. "What do you mean by that?" Adelaide didn't answer. She just closed her eyes and held Beatriz's hand. 2 days later, Dona Adelaide passed away. The funeral was simple, as she had wished. There were few attendees. Besides the nursing home staff and Beatriz, a few old neighbors and a few friends from her youth were present. Her children, dressed in black and with unreadable expressions, barely exchanged a word during the ceremony. It was only the next day that the storm came. Adelaide's lawyer gathered the 3 children in his office. With Beatriz present, he read the will word for word. "I declare as my only legal and legitimate heir, Beatriz da Silva Rocha, who, in the last years of my life, demonstrated love, patience, care, and humanity. To my children, I leave the letters I wrote with a wounded heart and a clear conscience. May they serve as a mirror, not a punishment." The silence in that room was deeper than any scream. Claudia stood up indignantly. "That's absurd. She was senile. She couldn't make that decision." The lawyer remained calm. The document was signed in front of witnesses with a medical report attesting to full consciousness. Everything is legally recorded. Marcos tried to negotiate. "We can challenge that. We can reverse it." Henry finally let out a sigh. "She warned. She tried. We were the ones who never wanted to listen." The lawyer handed each of them an envelope with their name handwritten on it. They were the letters Adelaide had mentioned. They opened them right there, unable to wait. Each letter contained painful truths. Marcos read about how ambition took him away from his family, and about the days when Adelaide waited for him, only to find he was at business dinners. Claudia received harsh words about her pride and vanity, about the way she traded affection for status, and how her mother always knew the lies she told about a perfect life. Enrique, although less guilty, also received a warning. Omission is also a form of abandonment. The three of them left the office in silence. And so the real weight of karma began. Nothing material was left behind. But Adelaide's words became invisible chains that would now follow them. The money they had hoped for never arrived. And the legacy they had neglected, love, presence, gratitude, they would never regain. Because what goes around comes around. And the pain of abandonment that they planted finally blossomed in the silence left by a mother who, even though forgotten, never forgot. She organized everything with Beatrice's help. She chose the menu: rice and lentils, roast chicken, and potato salad, one of the dishes she used to make when her children still came over on Sundays. She insisted on setting the table with a white crochet tablecloth she had knitted years ago. There were embroidered napkins, neatly lined plates, and simple but clean and well-arranged bowls. In the center of the table, she placed an old photo, she and her 3 children as children, smiling in front of the old family home. When the children arrived, each with their own practiced posture, they found their mother already seated at the head of the table. She was thin, but with neatly combed hair, subtle lipstick, and a long-lost sparkle in her eyes. Beatrice greeted them cordially and left the room, leaving only a tape recorder discreetly on a shelf at Adelaide's request. The silence was uncomfortable at first. Marcos was the first to try to break it. "Mom, you look good. This is nice. Nostalgic." Adelaide just smiled and served the dishes. Enrique cleared his throat. Claudia was fiddling with her cell phone. It was then that she began to speak in a firm, slow voice. "I wanted this lunch to say thank you, because even though you've forgotten me for years, your absence taught me more than your presence. Through silence, I learned to listen to myself. Through solitude, I learned the value of my own company." The children looked at each other. "Mom," Claudia tried to interrupt. "No, dear. Today, it's my turn to speak," he said sweetly but firmly. "You left me here thinking you were doing the right thing. That care was enough if it came from strangers. But care without affection is an empty obligation, and love without presence is just appearance." She took a deep breath. "For a long time I cried alone. I prayed for you to visit me. I wondered where I went wrong, but today I understand that it wasn't me who failed. It was you who chose to walk away. That's why I chose to move on, without expecting anything more." Silence. "I changed my will. You won't receive the assets I left behind. I chose to trust the one who was there for me when I needed them most. Someone who looked me in the eye every day with the truth." Enrique stood up, irritated. "That's absurd. You have no right to throw everything away out of spite." Adelaide just looked at him sweetly. "Yes, I do. The same right you had to forget me. The difference is that my choice is made in full consciousness, and with a peaceful heart." Marcos snorted, got up without saying a word, and left, slamming the door. Claudia stood there, her eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I didn't know it hurt that much." "Yes, I knew, I just didn't want to feel it. But now it doesn't matter anymore. I don't do this for revenge, I do it because I need to rest. And I rest better knowing I left everything in hands that truly cared for me," he said, looking at the door where Beatrice was discreetly peeking through. Adelaide then took 3 envelopes from her pocket, 1 for each child. "In them I leave what I can give most, the truth. Read them when you're ready." Enrique left in a hurry without taking his. Claudia took hers with trembling hands. Marcos didn't come back for his. Adelaide then finished her meal in silence. Later, when he retired to his room, he looked out the window at the sky and murmured, "I did my part." And that night, he fell asleep with a slight smile on his face. No guilt, no hurt, no regrets. In the world, outside, the consequences echoed, but inside her, finally, there was peace, and that was the most valuable legacy he left.